Right now, there is a woman in your life who is telling you something and you are missing it completely. Not because you are careless and not because you do not care enough to notice. You miss it because nobody ever taught you what to look for. Somewhere along the way, you learned to wait for words, a declaration, a big moment, something loud enough to prove itself. But that is not how most women actually show what they feel. They show it in something quieter, something so ordinary it slips right past you again and again without ever announcing itself. Think about that for a second. A gesture repeated, a question asked in passing, a silence that was never explained. You noticed it happen. You just never understood what it meant. That is exactly what we are going to change today. By the end of this video, you will be able to recognize the one signal almost every man your age overlooks, the one hiding in plain sight in conversations you have already had with someone who may already be showing you exactly where she stands. You just have not been able to see it yet. That changes now. You were taught to listen for the wrong words. That's not your fault. It's just outdated training. Most men your age grew up on a very specific script for how love is supposed to announce itself. Movies taught it, songs taught it. Even the men who raised you, whether they meant to or not, taught it through example. Love was supposed to arrive loudly. A confession, a grand gesture, a moment dramatic enough to be unmistakable. So that is what you learned to wait for. And when it never came in that form, you assumed nothing was happening at all. But here's the part almost nobody explains to you. Women, especially the ones who have lived long enough to be careful with their feelings, rarely speak love out loud first. They test the waters instead. They watch. They wait to see if it is safe. Psychologists call this risk-averse disclosure, the tendency to reveal emotional investment slowly through small actions before ever putting it into words that could be rejected. In plain terms, she shows you before she tells you, because showing you costs her less if you do not show it back. Of course, this does not mean every woman behaves identically, or that timelines look the same for everyone. Context always matters, but the underlying pattern holds surprisingly consistent once you know what to look for. Think back to a conversation that once seemed completely ordinary, one where you walked away without realizing what had actually just happened. That conversation may have already told you everything you needed to know. You just were not listening in the right language. There is a real language underneath the words, one built from behavior, timing, and small repeated choices. It is quieter than what you were trained to expect. It does not announce itself. But before you can learn to read that language fluently, you need to understand something else first, because the way a woman expresses this changes significantly depending on where she is in life, and that shift matters more than most men realize. The woman in front of you now is not the woman she was at 25, and neither is her love language. At 25, emotional expression tends to be less guarded, more impulsive, sometimes even reckless. There is less history to protect and less to lose. But by the time a woman reaches her 40s, 50s, or later, she has usually accumulated something else entirely, more experience. Past relationships that did not work, trust that was tested and sometimes broken, a clearer sense of what it actually costs to open up to someone and be wrong about them. That accumulated experience changes behavior. Researchers who study attachment across adulthood have observed that older adults tend to shift toward what is sometimes called selective emotional investment, choosing more deliberately who receives visible signs of affection, rather than offering them freely the way younger people often do. In plain language, she is not withholding because she feels less. She is withholding because she has learned that feeling too openly too soon can be expensive. Now you might be thinking, doesn't that just mean she is guarded, closed off, harder to read? Sometimes yes, but guarded is not the same as absent. The signals are still there. They are simply smaller, quieter, and more deliberate than the ones you were trained to expect in your 20s. This is not something to fear. If anything, it is the opposite. A woman who has learned caution does not waste her signals. When she does show something, it tends to mean more, not less. Of course, this does not follow a fixed timeline for everyone. Some people carry more caution than others, shaped by circumstances you may never fully know. But the shift towards selective, deliberate expression tends to hold true broadly enough to be worth understanding. So the real question becomes, if the obvious signs are gone, what replaces them? What does investment actually look like once a woman has learned to protect herself? The first replacement signal shows up in a moment most men mistake for nothing at all: silence. There's a kind of silence that feels like rejection, and there's a kind that is actually the deepest compliment she can give you. Most men experience silence as a warning sign. She stopped talking. She seemed distant. Immediately, the mind fills that gap with worry. Did I say something wrong? Is she losing interest? That reaction is understandable, but it is also very often exactly backwards. Attachment researchers describe something called comfortable silence as a marker of relational security, the ability to sit quietly with another person without needing conversation to feel safe. In plain language, silence without tension means she does not feel the need to perform for you. She is simply existing in it, next to you, without anxiety. Picture this specifically. You are driving somewhere together or sitting across a table after the meal is finished and neither of you is speaking. Her shoulders are relaxed. She is not checking her phone, not glancing toward the door, not filling the air to avoid discomfort. She is simply there, present, unhurried. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this just mean she's tired or has nothing to say? Sometimes, yes, context matters here. A single quiet car ride proves little on its own. But when that same relaxed silence repeats across different settings and different days, that repetition is what separates a passing mood from a genuine signal. The common mistake most men make is filling the silence anyway, talking to fix a feeling that was never actually broken. Doing that can undo the very safety she was showing you. There is one additional layer to this that most explanations completely skip over. The quality of the silence matters just as much as the silence itself. A tense silence carries a specific physical signature. Arms crossed, a jaw held tight, eyes that avoid rather than settle. A comfortable silence looks almost the opposite. Her posture stays open. Her breathing stays even. She might even lean slightly towards you without appearing to notice she is doing it. That distinction shows up in the body before it ever shows up in words. You are not expected to read every micro movement like a scientist. What matters is noticing the difference between silence that feels heavy and silence that feels light. Remember what I told you at the start, that there was one signal most men not only miss, but actively misread. We are getting closer to it now, and silence is only the first piece of it. If silence can mean this much, imagine what the small, repeated things she does might actually be telling you. That question leads straight into the second signal, one so small, most men don't even register it as meaningful. It won't look like romance. It will look like nothing at all, and that's exactly the point. Human beings are wired to notice intensity. A grand gesture, a dramatic confession, a moment that stands out from everything around it, these are easy to spot because they interrupt the ordinary flow of life. But real emotional investment, especially in someone who has learned to be careful, rarely shows up that way. Instead, it shows up as consistency, the same small thing, repeated without fanfare over and over again. Behavioral researchers sometimes call this low-cost signaling, small, easy-to-perform actions that, because they are repeated so reliably, end up carrying more weight than a single dramatic gesture ever could. In plain language, one grand moment can be staged. A pattern repeated across weeks and months without anyone asking for it is far harder to fake. Picture something specific. She remembers an offhand comment you made weeks ago, something small, something you barely registered saying yourself, and brings it back up naturally. Or she quietly adjusts her schedule again and again to make room for something that matters to you, without ever mentioning it. None of these moments on their own prove very much. Of course, a good memory does not automatically mean deep feeling. Some people simply pay close attention out of habit. But when the same pattern of small, unprompted consistency shows up again and again across different situations, that repetition becomes very difficult to explain away as coincidence. The common mistake here is dismissing these moments as too small to matter, while waiting for a bigger, more obvious sign that may never actually come in the form you expect. Before we move to the next signal, there is one additional layer to this that most explanations completely skip over. Consistency is not just about what she remembers or accommodates. It is also about timing. Notice whether these small gestures cluster around moments that matter to you specifically, rather than appearing randomly. A text that arrives right before something stressful you mentioned in passing, a small favor offered exactly when you needed it without you having to ask twice. That kind of timing is difficult to explain through habit alone, which tends to be steady and predictable, regardless of circumstance. What you are looking for instead is responsiveness, behavior that shifts and adapts around your life, your stress, your small unspoken needs. That responsiveness is a far stronger indicator than any single gesture. Small consistency like this is rarely accidental. It tends to be the quiet result of someone paying attention to you without being asked to. Which brings us to something even more revealing, the questions she asks you when she's quietly checking where she stands. When she asks something that sounds casual, she is rarely asking what she's actually asking. You have probably experienced this without realizing what it was. A question that seemed to come out of nowhere. What are you doing this weekend? Do you still talk to that person from before? Would you ever move somewhere else someday? Asked lightly, almost in passing, as if the answer did not matter very much. But it usually does matter. Psychologists refer to this pattern as low-risk emotional probing, asking small, seemingly harmless questions as a way of testing emotional safety before revealing anything more vulnerable. In plain language, she is checking the temperature of the water before deciding whether it is safe to get in. Here is what this actually looks like in a real conversation. She asks something that could easily be answered with a single word and then pauses, waiting. Not scrolling her phone, not filling the silence herself, genuinely waiting to see how much you choose to give back. If you answer briefly and move on, she often will too, matching your energy rather than pushing past it. If you open up even slightly, she tends to open up a little further herself. That back and forth is not accidental. It is a quiet negotiation over how much emotional risk each of you is willing to take, happening underneath a conversation that looks on the surface like nothing more than small talk. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just normal curiosity, the kind anyone might have about anyone? Sometimes yes, and context matters here as much as anywhere else. A single casual question proves very little by itself, but when these small tests keep appearing, especially around topics that touch your availability, your past, or your future, that repetition starts to reveal something more deliberate underneath the surface. The common mistake most men make is answering these questions too literally, treating them as pure information requests rather than recognizing the quiet, emotional test hidden inside them. Answer honestly, but notice what is actually being asked underneath the words. There is one more layer worth naming here. Watch for the follow-up question that comes several minutes later, almost unrelated, but circling back to the same underlying concern. That circling behavior is often the clearest sign that the original question mattered far more than it appeared to at the time. Think back to something ordinary, a moment where a question felt strangely specific for idle conversation, and you answered without pausing to wonder why she asked. That moment likely carried more weight than you gave it credit for. Of course, not every question is a hidden test, and reading too much into every sentence would eventually feel forced rather than genuine. The goal is simply awareness, noticing the pattern when it repeats, rather than treating every conversation as a puzzle to solve. And that brings us to the one signal almost no man ever catches, because it's hiding in plain sight disguised as something else entirely. Everything you've learned so far points to this one moment, the one almost every man walks past without noticing. Remember what I told you at the beginning of this video, that there was one signal hiding in plain sight that most men not only miss, but actively misread when it happens right in front of them. This is it. It has nothing to do with words at all. It happens in the body, in an instant, usually without her even realizing she is doing it. Psychologists call it guard-dropping behavior, the small, unconscious physical and verbal shifts that occur when someone feels genuinely safe enough to stop managing how they appear to another person. In plain language, it is the moment she stops performing and simply exists as herself in front of you. Picture it specifically. Mid-conversation, her voice changes slightly, not dramatically, just a small shift in pitch or pace, closer to how she probably sounds with an old friend than how she sounds meeting someone new. Her laugh becomes less controlled, sometimes a little too loud, sometimes cut short by her own surprise at herself. She might say something slightly awkward, then not rush to smooth it over the way people do when they are still trying to make an impression. This is the moment, not the compliment, not the grand gesture, the awkward, unpolished, unguarded second. Most men do not even register as meaningful because it does not look impressive. It looks like nothing. That is exactly why it gets missed so often. Here's the reasoning behind why this matters more than almost anything else on this list. Early in any connection, most people manage their presentation carefully, choosing words deliberately, controlling tone, avoiding anything that might make them look foolish. That management takes real effort, driven by fear of being judged or found lacking. When it drops away, even briefly, it means something specific happened underneath the surface. It means she decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that this was a person she did not need to protect herself from as carefully as before. Now, you might be thinking, Couldn't this just mean she's simply comfortable by nature, relaxed with everyone? Sometimes, yes, and context matters here more than anywhere else in this video. But notice whether this unguarded version of her shows up specifically around you, more than it does elsewhere. Whether the relaxed voice, the too loud laugh, the unfiltered comment appear more often in your presence than in a room full of strangers. That contrast turns a personality trait into a genuine signal about you specifically. The common mistake here is almost the opposite of every mistake before it. Men who finally notice this moment often try to comment on it directly, pointing out that she seems more relaxed, more herself, more open than usual. That instinct, understandable as it is, can undo the very thing that made the moment real in the first place. Safety, once it is named out loud and examined too closely, has a way of quietly disappearing again. The better response is simpler than it sounds. Match her. Let your own guard soften slightly in return, without announcing that you noticed anything at all. This signal is rarely a single, isolated moment that appears once and vanishes. More often, it is the natural result of everything we walked through earlier. The comfortable silence, the small, remembered detail, the casual question that was really a quiet test. Each moment on its own might have seemed too small to matter. Together, they build toward exactly this, a point where guarding herself around you simply stops feeling necessary. That is why the earlier signals matter as much as this final one. Stages of the same process, each slowly lowering the emotional cost of being open with you. So if you recognize even one or two of these moments already happening in your own life, that recognition is not a small thing. It means you are already further along than you realized. That is the moment most men walk away from without realizing it. Now that you can see it, the only question left is what you do the next time it happens in front of you. So here is what all of this really comes down to. A comfortable silence, a small detail remembered without being asked to, a casual question that was never really casual, a guard that quietly drops when she feels safe enough to stop managing herself around you. None of these moments are loud. None of them announce themselves the way you were once taught to expect, but together they form a language. One that has probably been speaking to you for longer than you realized. You do not need to overanalyze every conversation from here forward, turning every silence into a puzzle. That was never the point. The point is simply this. You now know what to look for, and that alone changes how you experience the next ordinary moment that comes your way. I want to know something from you. Which of these signals have you already noticed in your own life and didn't realize what it meant until now? Tell me in the comments because I genuinely read every one of them. In the next video, I'll show you the one sentence women say when they're pulling away and why it almost always means the opposite of what it sounds like.